In April 1945, as World War II in Europe approached its final days, the once powerful German Wehrmacht began to collapse across multiple fronts. Near Prague, in what was then Czechoslovakia, German forces found themselves surrounded, exhausted, and facing an inevitable end. What followed was not a final stand, but a mass disarmament, as thousands of German soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. For years, the Wehrmacht had been a dominant military force, advancing rapidly across Europe in the early stages of the war. But by 1945, that strength had eroded. Continuous defeats, dwindling supplies, and relentless pressure from Allied forces had pushed Germany to the brink. The Eastern Front, in particular, had become a disaster. Soviet forces were advancing westward with overwhelming numbers, determined to crush the remnants of Nazi resistance. Near Prague, German units were caught in a tightening encirclement. Many of these soldiers were not elite troops, but a mix of exhausted veterans, young recruits, and hastily assembled units. Their equipment was worn, their morale was low, and their leadership was increasingly fragmented. Orders from high command were often unrealistic, calling for resistance even when defeat was certain. As Soviet forces advanced closer, the situation became desperate. Many German soldiers understood the reputation of the Red Army and feared what might happen if they were captured. Reports of harsh treatment and retaliation for the devastation inflicted on Soviet territory had spread widely among German ranks. This fear created a sense of urgency among many units to surrender whenever possible, especially if there was any chance of falling into Western Allied hands instead. Despite these fears, the pace of the Soviet advance left little room for maneuver. German troops near Prague were cut off from escape routes and faced overwhelming firepower. In many cases, officers chose to surrender to save their men's lives. Weapons were laid down, vehicles were abandoned, and organized resistance began to dissolve. The disarmament process was often chaotic. Large groups of soldiers gathered under guard, waiting to be processed as prisoners of war. Some arrived in columns, while others came in scattered groups after leaving their positions. Many carried little more than what they could hold, having discarded heavy equipment during their retreat. For the soldiers, surrender marked a sudden shift from combatants to captives. The uncertainty of their fate weighed heavily on them. They did not know where they would be taken, how they would be treated, or how long they would remain in captivity. Hunger, exhaustion, and anxiety were common among the prisoners as they were marched away from the front lines. For the civilians in the region, the sight of disarmed German troops was a powerful symbol of change. Just years earlier, these same forces had occupied and controlled large parts of Czechoslovakia. Now, they were defeated, guarded, and stripped of their authority. The balance of power had shifted completely. As April turned to May, the war in Europe was entering its final chapter. The disarmament of German forces near Prague was part of a larger pattern unfolding across the continent. Entire armies were surrendering, and the structure of Nazi Germany was collapsing from within. Communication lines had broken down, and many units were acting independently, often choosing surrender over continued resistance. In the days that followed, Prague itself would become the center of a major uprising against the remaining German forces in the city. Resistance fighters, supported by advancing Allied troops, sought to reclaim control and end the occupation. The broader context of these events highlighted the rapid and irreversible downfall of Nazi rule. For the captured German soldiers, captivity would bring a long and uncertain journey. Many would spend months or even years as prisoners of war, held in camps across Europe and the Soviet Union. Their experiences varied widely, shaped by the conditions of the camps and the policies of their captors. The disarmament near Prague in April 1945 stands as a moment of transition. It marked the end of organized resistance in that region and reflected the wider collapse of a regime that had once dominated much of Europe. It was not a dramatic final battle, but a quiet and decisive conclusion where weapons were laid down and the war, for many, simply ended. In the end, the surrender of these forces was part of a much larger story. It was the closing chapter of a conflict that had brought immense destruction and loss. The disarmed soldiers, once instruments of war, became witnesses to its end, as Europe moved toward an uncertain but hopeful future beyond the shadow of war.